Welcome, my name is Michael Theed. I work for CEIBS here in Shanghai. Today we are speaking with Professor of International Business and Strategy, Shameen Prashantham, about his new book, Gorillas Can Dance. So Professor Shameen, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Michael.
So jumping right in, Gorillas Can Dance, what is it about?
Gorillas Can Dance is a book about how large corporations can partner effectively with startups.
So I know this is actually the culmination of maybe 10 or 12 years of research that you've been doing in this area. So how did you first get interested in sort of corporate startup partnerships, and where did you get the idea to write this book?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's been a long time in the making. When I was doing my doctoral studies in Scotland, I was fortunate to be in an international business research unit set up by two eminent scholars, Neil Hood and Stephen Young. They made a name for themselves looking at large multinational corporations, a lot of them American companies that had subsidiaries in Scotland. And then they had a number of doctoral students who looked at how smaller companies can go international. I was one of them. And in the process, I began to observe that some smaller companies were partnering with large corporations. And I mentioned this once my PhD was done, as I was thinking maybe this could be the next thing I look at. And I mentioned this casually. We just had a hallway conversation, Neil Hood and I. And at that time, Neil had a position of leadership in Scottish Enterprise. And he said, well, this is interesting. You should say this, because at this moment, we're thinking about how to help the multinational subsidiaries in Scotland that want to up their game and do more innovation to connect with our very talented, smaller entrepreneurial firms that want to scale up. And so that was my first opportunity to observe this phenomenon. And I then ran into another eminent professor, C.K. Prahlad, at a conference and asked him whether he thought this was worth studying. And he said, in my opinion, the small company has no choice but to partner with the large gorilla. And that gave rise to this notion of dancing with gorillas, which became the title of an article I co-authored with Julian Birkinshaw in California Management Review. And then I sort of stayed with this phenomenon for a while and kept observing how it evolved and how big companies started taking this seriously, and then flipped my focus to looking at it from the point of view of the big company, the gorilla, and that's how Dancing with Gorillas became Gorillas Can Dance. And so I'm very grateful for those initial opportunities I had in Scotland to get involved in this. And as it happens, Steve Young very recently passed away. And so I take this opportunity to pay tribute to Steve. Without Steve, I don't think I would have had this opportunity to observe this very interesting phenomenon.
Why is it so imperative for large corporations to consider partnering with startups?
So, Michael, the issue that big companies have is that they become good at doing something, and that in fact gets in the way of them learning new tricks. Many companies that have been successful have become successful for good reason. They have been able to address the needs of the market at a particular point in time, but then the market environment changes, business forces changes, and of course what's been happening at a very great pace in the past 10 to 15 years has been technological changes. In fact, because they're so good at doing what they're doing, don't find it easy to develop the new capabilities they need. This has been a long-standing challenge that companies have had. What has sort of become more apparent to companies in the past 10 years, maybe even more so in the last 5 years, is that it makes sense for them to engage with startups. In fact, startups are very often the source of the disruption they face. So managers in a big company can see the entrepreneurs on the outside as adversarial, so sort of a manager versus entrepreneur kind of feel. And therefore, many big companies have realized they have to become more entrepreneurial, managers as entrepreneurs. And one way in which they can do this is by tapping the entrepreneurial energy and talent on the outside. And that's the notion of managers with entrepreneurs that this book and my research has been about.
What are some of the benefits to corporations of partnering with startups?
Well, I mean, there are many, many benefits, but I think of these in terms of 3 L's. Opportunity to gain more learning ideas and approaches and business models. there's scope to gain more leads, meaning more revenue generating opportunities by connecting what the big company has with what the smaller company has. And thirdly, and this may be surprising, but I also think more legitimacy. That is actually something that the big company has in spades, which the small startups don't. But I actually have been observing how big companies have been trying to win the hearts and minds of startups because they are, in a sense, competing with other big companies for the attention of the startups too. Therefore, being seen as a partner of choice in the startup community, I guess, gives them also more legitimacy in that arena, which makes it easier to attract high-quality startup partners.
Okay, and so conversely, I guess, what are some of the benefits to startups in terms of partnering with corporations?
And again, I would use the same 3 L's. But maybe in sort of reverse order. The legitimacy benefits for the startups are clear to see. They don't have a track record. Why should people take them seriously? But then they gain sort of credibility by association when they have large partners they can talk about. Then they too get new leads and new opportunities by tapping into the partner ecosystems of these big companies. And there's also learning that they can get. So whereas on the one hand, the big companies learning new tricks from them potentially, startups can actually learn professional practices, managerial practices, because in the end, the startup too is aspiring to become an established company. On paper, there's a great possibility for a win-win collaboration.
So you make the point in your book that partnering is great, but it's not always easy. So what are some of the challenges that corporations and startups face when partnering with one another?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Michael. And in fact, when I teach about this in class, I have slides about the potential benefits for each side of working together. And then I have a slide that says, but. And the but is, there is what I call a paradox of asymmetry. The very differences that make it attractive for these companies to work together also makes it challenging to do so. And I identify 3 asymmetries. Asymmetry of goals. These different companies are wanting to achieve different things and also at different timescales. There is an asymmetry of structure. There are very different types of hierarchies in both sides, very difficult to find role counterparts. And there's the asymmetry of attention in the sense that the big company can see an ocean of startups out there and they're not clear which startups are worthy of their attention. From the startup's point of view, they know who the gorillas are, but they don't know who within the gorilla they should be approaching and talking to and gaining the attention of. And I've come across startups that have wasted 3 to 6 months trying to find the right person within a big company to talk to. And that kind of delay can actually kill a startup.
So how can partners start to sort of address or overcome some of these challenges?
So that's very much at the heart of what I've been studying, observing what different companies have been trying to do. In terms of overcoming the asymmetry of goals, what I've observed is that companies seek to clarify their synergies. That may seem obvious, but it isn't actually in practice. And so making clear what the win-win is important. And I've seen 2 broad types here. One is what we may think of as building block-based synergies, where typically IT companies have platform technologies and they want other startups to build on top of this. So companies like Microsoft and SAP would typically promote those kinds of synergies. And then you might have also pain point-based synergies, where non-IT companies, say Unilever, wants to find solutions to address some of their digital marketing challenges, and a startup might be able to address that. Or BMW wants to improve their autonomous driving, and again, a startup might be able to address that pain point. And then in terms of addressing the asymmetry of structure, creating interfaces so that startups know who their first port of call should be. And there I've seen 2 types. cohorts where startups come together for a period of time, typically in a corporate accelerator, and the other would be funnels, where sort of like a contest, an innovation contest, startups get progressively screened out. They may never even know who else is part of the process until the corporate finds the startups they need to address some of the challenges they have. And then in terms of addressing the asymmetry of attention, what I've observed is that the experienced corporations cultivate exemplars, success stories, so that it becomes evident where the big companies should be focusing their attention, and startups also have a better understanding of what success will look like, and therefore what they should draw the corporate managers' attention to. I find that this is useful not only to be able to attract other high-quality applicants when you can see the success stories, but also to persuade skeptical internal audiences within the company. Because at the end of the day, the managers running the startup interfaces will only be able to deliver exemplars when business unit leaders and other managers within the company are willing to collaborate with these startups.
So if I'm a manager in a big corporation, for example, how can I go about getting started partnering with startups and sort of helping my organization kind of build the capabilities that are required in order to make that happen?
I think the first thing to recognize is that it's non-trivial. Many companies have developed a good partnering capability when it comes to other big companies, but I think it's important to understand that when you're dealing with startups, for the reasons we've discussed, like the paradox of asymmetry, you may need to do things in a different way. So to develop this more distinctive startup partnering capability, I think the first thing is you have to initiate the process. And there I think it's useful, as Simon Sinek once said, dream big or think big, start small, but get started. And so doing something initially, I think, is important, because sometimes you get into this paralysis by analysis. I think it's important to just get started, try something, even a hackathon or something. By the way, doing a hackathon here or another event there in the larger scheme of things isn't going to move the needle. But as a way to maybe get started and then pause and reflect and see what have we learned from this and so on. And sometimes I find that there are bottom-up approaches that work better. You find entrepreneurial kind of managers within a big company who go ahead and start and maybe even seek forgiveness rather than permission to get started. So I think getting started is important, and I've seen this happen in many different ways, and it's not always with the blessing of some big boss. An enterprising manager can make something happen, relatively small even. But then just that isn't going to help. So then the next step is expanding on this. And this is where then bringing a lot of buy-in becomes important. And I find that where there has been success in expanding initial efforts, three different types of internal managers have been involved. One that I call the sort of internal champions, typically senior managers, who give their blessing to these activities and lend more legitimacy to it. And then there are the opportunity generators, the people in the business units who are willing to engage with startups, work on them on pilots and things like that. And then there are also what I call roving ambassadors, a broader set of people that skillful startup interface managers will sort of get excited about what's going on, so that they become aware of what's happening. They might even be willing to mentor some of these startups. And in the process, the startups understand better how to engage with the big company. And finally, systematizing what's going on. Because in the end, startup partnering will be effective only when it has a strategic impact on what the company is doing. And this involves somehow bringing this into the wider innovation effort, bringing this into the wider culture change effort, and also bringing this into ultimately the core strategy. The lead case in my company is Microsoft. And I think Microsoft has sought to do this extremely well, because the co-sell program that they have, whereby Microsoft salespeople are incentivized to sell not only Microsoft's own products, but also products that are developed by partners, including startups, means that startup partnering now feels like it's very much part of the overall core strategy.
You also make the point in your book that corporations have the opportunity to partner with startups, not just locally, but actually all over the world. And moreover, that they really have the opportunity now to actually learn from those startups. So what are some of the ways in which they can do that?
Absolutely. And in fact, this has actually been one of the great privileges of the last 15 years, that I've been able to study this phenomenon in the US, the UK, other parts of Europe like Germany, as well as Israel, China, of course, India, and latterly Africa. And I think large multinationals have this huge advantage of being able to harness startups in different parts of the world. And even as sort of globalization slows down in the sort of from the perspective of trade and things like that, I hope managers don't lose sight of this huge advantage that they have, especially when they're part of a large multinational, to tap into different startup ecosystems around the world. And I think it's useful to think about this in three ways. One is the classic way of dealing with global strategy, which is think global, act local, which means you adapt startup partnering practices to different markets. So when you bring a startup partnering practice developed in the West to an emerging market, you have to make certain adjustments. But there's also the think local, act global perspective, which is we can learn from these startups, but also we can learn about startup partnering practices. And this is where Israel, for example, has been a very fertile area for the development of new ideas like how to engage with startups to corporate accelerators. And finally, and this may sound counterintuitive, but sort of think global, act global. And here what I mean is think about different locations as a portfolio. For example, emerging markets and advanced markets on the one hand, and clusters like Silicon Valley or Zhongguancun in Beijing on the one hand, and non-clusters, places which are sort of off the beaten track. And I think in each of these different types of places, one can still engage with startups. When you're off the beaten track, engaging with policymakers, I find, is very important. And so ultimately, it's really about being aware that there is much to be gained and different benefits to gain. And finally, I would also add, I think there are frontier markets in Africa where very interesting things are happening. And because of the Africa campus that CEIBS has there, I've been fortunate to engage with that part of the world. And it's very interesting to see how it's possible for startups and corporations to work together in ways that also have social impact.
So in your book, you also talk about the role that corporate startup partnerships can play as sort of a force for good in the world. So why do you think that these types of partnerships are particularly well suited to this role?
This notion really came to me most clearly in Africa as I started talking to entrepreneurs and big companies there, because so many of the problems that entrepreneurs are addressing just inherently have social impact, but they're seeking to do this in a way that have economic payoff. And so when big companies are trying to engage with those startups there, and by the way, not merely as an act of charity, but because they see the future potential of that region and they kind of want to catch them young and start working with these startups early on, that has sort of been one of the basic rationales for big companies wanting to partner with startups. But when I see what's happening over there, you can very clearly see that in this process, you have social impact, which can be thought about in terms of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations adopted in September 2015. And in fact, since about then, I have seen corporates partnering with startups at an even greater scale in general. And so you put these two things together and you can see the scope for not only economic payoff, but social impact for societal good to happen. And you see this in so many different areas in terms of fintech, inclusive finance, in terms of supply chain management, again, trying to make sure that digital technologies are more inclusive and result in fair trade practices and so on. So I've seen a fintech startup partnering with Barclays and resulting in enormous societal good. And in fact, in that case, because of COVID, where so many small companies were struggling with cash flow, this startup's technology was extremely effective, but it would never have been able to scale without its partnership with Barclays. And so in this way, I can see a lot of scope for startups and corporates to work together as a force for good. And just before the pandemic became a global challenge, Microsoft announced a global social entrepreneurship program. And the initial startups that were included in this program were from Africa. And that sort of very much vindicated this view that I'd been forming. And I sincerely hope in the 2020s, this so-called decade of action, where the world really needs to do its very best to progress the Sustainable Development Goals, that corporate startup partnering will be one very useful tool and part of SDG 17, which is partnering for the goals.
So you've just mentioned the UN SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals, and I know that this is something that you're very passionate about personally, not just as, I guess, as a researcher, as an author, but also as the director of the MBA program here at CEIBS. So in your book, you identify a number of sort of mindsets that kind of link corporate startup partnerships with this SDG decade of action. Can you sort of explain a little bit more about that?
You're absolutely right. As an educator, I'm very passionate about the Sustainable Development Goals, and my hope is that every MBA student at this school will, at a minimum, have a strong awareness of these, and ideally will leave the campus adopting one SDG as something of a passion for them, either that they will address through their work or in their personal time through volunteering efforts, or ideally both. And in terms of what I've observed about the managers and the entrepreneurs who do well at partnering together, there are these three key mindsets I've seen. The first is an entrepreneurial mindset, and that kind of addresses the first part of this whole issue of startup corporate partnering, which is the why. Why do we do it? It's because being more entrepreneurial is important in this fast-paced, dynamic world. The second is a collaborative mindset, and that's of course at the heart of partnering and working together. And the third piece is the global mindset that makes one look beyond one's backyard for solutions, for ideas, and have respect for what is coming out of other contexts and cultures. And just to have the humility that, we might not have all the answers in our neck of the woods, but, with an open mind, we can learn from the world and everyone can benefit. And these are three mindsets that I believe, whether you're directly involved in corporate startup partnering or not, will actually hold you in good stead in your career, in your life. And I don't think we've been at any point in history where we need these more.
So looking back over maybe the last 10 to 15 years of work that you've been sort of doing in this area, how has the sort of landscape for partnering sort of changed in that time, and where do you sort of see it going in the future?
So when I started my research, even that initial article in California Management Review back in 2008, the examples I had happened almost by accident. They were very ad hoc. There was a sort of very entrepreneurial kind of manager in a big company who went out of their way to work with a startup, or a really persistent entrepreneur who managed to make a partnership happen. I think by now, most companies accept that they have to be entrepreneurial. Many sort of pay lip service to the idea that they should engage with startups. I think now people are grappling with, but how do we do this? How do we really make this work? So in other words, this sort of engagement is becoming more sophisticated. I think it's also helped that as a broader umbrella, the notion of open innovation has taken root in many companies. And I think going forward, the challenge will really be mainstreaming this more and more, so that it's not happening in one quirky little unit of a company, but that it's actually making a difference as a whole. Taking a step back, what I would say is, If you look at the period between when I wrote that California Management Review article with Julian Birkinshaw in 2008 and where we are now in the early 2020s, there have been some big changes, one in terms of digitalization, another in terms of geopolitics, and then also the rise of inequality and the greater urgent need for addressing sustainability, in particular climate change. And I think all of these issues will continue to affect the strategic imperatives of companies. And it is my hope that one of the key ways in which companies can navigate this very complex world is by recognizing that they don't have to do it all themselves. Partnering with other companies, dissimilar others, non-traditional allies, is very much one of the important ways in which we can come up with creative solutions that we need. And boy, do we need them. I mean, this is a very unsettled world, struggling with many challenges, including COVID. But the more we are able to work together and tap into non-traditional allies, different partners, and not be afraid of doing it, but rather embrace this at the same time without being naive, recognizing there's a challenge. I am hopeful that that can help to make a difference.
Finally, where and when can we get a copy of Gorillas Can Dance?
The date I have for the official release is the 28th of September. I imagine in North America it will be available immediately. In other parts of the world, I suppose it will be a function of how long books take to ship to the nearby warehouses. But this autumn and the final quarter of 2021, the book is certainly going to be available in most parts of the world, and I'm certainly very excited about this.
Okay, congratulations on your book. We're looking forward to getting a copy of it, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Michael.